All right. So I saw that you've got a continuous glucose monitor. I showed you that I had just taken mine off, like literally yesterday. My son wants to keep pulling it off. He's like, Mama, why are you wearing this thing? And this is probably what I consider to be the ultimate biomarker of our resilience and our metabolic health and overall energy. And I was curious, it's easy for us to do some of these things, to be tracking this, and then it's equally as easy not to. And so I would love for you to share kind of why is it that you love to kind of track this information for yourself? And what are some of the greatest insights that you get out of wearing a continuous glucose monitor?
Yeah, absolutely. So I got into this field because I've been fascinated with metabolic health and glucose. So I was drawn to it because I think it's so important and was interested in being a user on the other side as well as running the company and running the team. So I've worn, I don't even know how many CGMs at this point, 100 maybe, and there was a period in the beginning, 6, 7, 8 years ago when I started doing this that I wore them back to back to back to learn as much as possible. But now, as you mentioned, I put this on for my own benefits. I put it on every quarter, every few months to check up on things. So for this instance in particular, I live in Arizona. It's very hot in the summers. And so I was in Canada for the past month, kind of escaping the heat. And it was sort of out of my normal routine. So I was doing kind of home workouts rather than going to the gym or going to my regular classes. I was eating with my significant other's family, which might not have been the food I was normally preparing. So it's a little out of my routine. And I got back to Arizona and I put it on to get me back on track and be accountable. So for me, it keeps me honest. It's like a truth meter, so to speak. So I put it on and I make sure kind of what's happened in the last month. Is there any deviations in my baseline, and hold me accountable to really getting back on track? My mom, bless her heart, she was watching my pets and my plants while I was gone. And I always know when she's here because she always leaves me chocolate covered pretzels, even though I tell her not to every time. So I put the CGM on and they're not tempting anymore because I don't want to see the glucose spike that comes from them. It's just not worth it. So little things like that it helps me stay on track. But another example is even before I left for Canada, I wore one while it was peak of the summer here because I wasn't going on my regular walks. I felt like I wasn't moving as much. And so I put one on to kind of see how that was impacting my baseline glucose levels. And it did seem a little higher. So I felt like my average glucose, my fasting glucose was a little higher than regular because I wasn't moving as much. So that was kind of something where, okay, my environment has changed, my routine has changed. So let me put one on to see what it looks like and how I might need to adjust. So I tried to do more standing desk and kind of just movement throughout the day while I was working.
Yeah, I was curious, as I've worn one over the years and now I just basically wear one quarterly. Sometimes I go a little bit longer than that. And I just had one on as of recent, but to me, the number one thing, at least in my N of one experience, and I'd love for you to speak into the data around this. And obviously what I eat very much matters all the time. But what it keeps my glucose, what I consider to be relatively an optimal range, is the amount of movement, neat movement that I'm doing every single day. The more that I move and intentionally, whether that's going for walks or doing jump squats, if you see my son and I out and about, especially around dinner and lunch, we are doing jump squats. He doesn't know why he's doing it. I haven't really, I'm like, does he really need to know that it's about blood glucose
It's just
regulation?
fun for him. Yeah.
He just loves it. So we were at Disneyland yesterday. We were having dinner, and mind you, I bring so much food to Disneyland because it's very hard to find super healthy things. I mean, they try a little bit, but for the most part, it's a no go.
Yeah.
And we ended up staying a little bit later than we wanted because it's my sister's birthday, and so we ended up having dinner there. And Kingston and I are just busting out the jump squats, and it's dance squats, it's jump squats, it's silly squats, it's all these things. But for 5 minutes, we are the mother son duo. Everyone's just looking at what are these two doing? And I have seen it repeatedly over and over and over again on my continuous glucose monitor. Like if I want to keep that blood glucose, stable and steady, especially at dinner, it's movement always. Obviously, and
Yeah.
it's what I'm choosing for dinner too. But movement's always going to keep me in optimal range.
Yeah, absolutely. It can't be understated how powerful of a tool movement is. And some people are overwhelmed by the idea of having to like go to the gym and physically do workouts, which is important. We want to build up your lean body mass. We want to be increasing your endurance strength. But any type of movement can really help your metabolic health and your glucose control. So it can be really simple things like you're saying, and it can be fun. So it could be silly squats. I love that. That's adorable. And what a fun like bonding experience and kind of routine you have with your son along the way. You guys are both benefiting, but it brings, such a huge impact. Of course, what you're eating is going to have potentially even more of an impact, but think of exercise as that tool. So it's helping to dispose of the glucose in your system. It's helping to improve insulin sensitivity and kind of get your glucose levels back into that great range, especially if maybe you had a meal that wasn't what you might normally be eating, like you're mentioning. You're kind of out of your routine. This was happening a lot in Canada. It was 3 hours later in a different time zone. So we were eating dinners kind of late. We were cooking as a group, which is really fun. But maybe some foods that I wouldn't normally be eating at home. So we had a long routine of kind of going on an hour-long walk afterwards around the lake. It's very peaceful, kind of enjoying the outdoors, but making sure we're getting in more movement to counteract the fact that we're eating a little differently than we are at home.
I know, I feel that 100%. I'm just going to give another little mini example. And this is kind of like how you can have your cake and eat it too. And mind you, again, it's one of those rare treat moments. It was my birthday a week ago. And that is so true. Like you're talking about wearing the CGM and the chocolate pretzels.
Yeah.
And you're just like, I just don't want to see it. I don't want to see that
It's not
rise.
tempting anymore. You're like, it's not worth it.
I don't want to bust out those 50 jump squats to get that back into range. But I ordered this really sexy gluten-free, dairy-free cacao chocolate cake. And for my birthday, I was basically the party assistant. We had like 10 kids. Like I didn't have cake that day, but then the next day we had leftovers, and I promised my son we'd get to have some because he knew it was in the fridge. He knew what was up. And so I was trying to, I'm like, okay, how am I going to wheel and deal this? So we had we had salmon for dinner with salad, and then we decided to do the chocolate cake. And I was determined to not have a glucose rise. I was like, okay, how do I keep this within like 5, maybe 10 points? Okay. And mind you, it by no means am I obsessive with this, but I just know it's nighttime. I'm eating cake. Like I know what's going to go down. I know how it's going to go. So we took a bike ride to our favorite beach. So I did a 25-minute bike ride after I ate this, and I was excited to report I had a 6-point rise, and that was it. And it was so much.
That's impressive. Yeah.
Yeah, I worked it. Okay. And so I was like, yes. And so we get to, again, this was a treat. It wasn't, I don't do this often. I'm a big fan of really keeping it savory, but it was a special occasion, and I really did make the most of that. So I was really proud of myself.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think data like this, and not just CGM, it can be even like, your Apple Watch or your Fitbit or any sort of like biofeedback tool, helps people to make more mindful decisions like that, where it's like, I really enjoy this cake. You got something you really like, and then you did it in a way that still made you feel good, still felt like worthwhile. So it helps people to make these mindful decisions, where maybe if I wasn't wearing the CGM, it's like, okay, I'll have a couple of these pretzels and then maybe I'll give the bag away to my friend, but you're not making as mindful decision. Yeah. Or, it could be something that you don't even really like that much, that's going to bring your glucose up, and you're just kind of eating it without thinking about it too much, or it's not really worthwhile to you, but you're doing it anyway because it's in front of you or because someone cooked it and put it on the side. So it helps you to kind of make those intentional trade-offs so you can literally have your cake and eat it too. Because a lot of people think, oh, I'll wear one of these and my diet's going to become more restrictive. I'm going to learn that I can never eat cake ever again, or I'm going to learn that I can never do XYZ. But often it kind of gives you more flexibility to figure out, okay, I can do it if I had some movement beforehand, or if it's not too late in the night, or if I had a good dinner with some protein first. So it kind of gives you some of these strategies to live a little bit more freely and intentionally.
And that's exactly how it feels to me, is being intentional. I mean, one of the things that I like my through line, the thought process is, is this going to make really great future brain cells? How is this going to turn and convert into a future brain? And then, and I build most of our meals, our metabolically healthy meals by that. And then there are these little special moments, right? Where we get, now that I've got all these beautiful strategies and I really have a deep understanding of my kind of, like I said, that ultimate biomarker, I can really kind of play with it and be intentional around it. And in some ways, in that particular instance, it was almost kind of gamifying it to see like, okay, how is this going to play out? And we'll see. Also with the intention of really enjoying it and being present with my son, and then us going and watching the sunset and playing at the playground right after that. And so it just ultimately was a really great experience, and it was a lot of fun. And I got to keep my blood glucose within a range that I was really excited about. But I do want to speak into intentionality when it comes to our cellular energy and our metabolism, because ultimately that is what we're talking about here. We're talking about keeping good cellular energy in the body, and that the first step is what we're putting into our bodies to create that molecular information.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, a lot, metabolic health is becoming, and metabolism is coming a little bit more of like a common word or a little bit more of a buzzword, but it's exactly that. It is the process of turning food into usable energy, right? That like cellular energy process. So when we think about metabolic health as like an engine or a system, it's really how finely tuned are these processes to turn that energy efficiently into usable energy that your body can either store and then easily tap into or use right away. So it's kind of an operating process machine. I compare it to something like good metabolic health is a really well-oiled operating machine like Amazon. Think about you order something and it comes to your door sometimes within hours, minutes. It's incredible. So it's a finely tuned operating machine where it's very efficient, and they figured out the best way to deliver something. Where if we have really good metabolic health, it's almost the same exact thing. It's the same thought process where we eat something and we turn that into usable energy that can fuel us to do something else. But when our metabolic health is not so good, then that gets kind of broken along the way. And that's when we tend to store energy inefficiently, tap into energy inefficiently, not use energy well, which is why we feel tired, lethargic, we're gaining weight, we're not able to lose weight as well. So a lot of this comes down to really how do we turn our food into that proper cellular energy like you're talking about.
Yeah, I want to get into that. And I think for many of us, we don't really, so often you can't see triglycerides. You can't feel your triglycerides going up. You can't necessarily, I think you and I could both make a case of, a blood sugar spike and crash, like with some symptoms around that. But for the most part, kind of that steady increase in fasting blood glucose, someone may not notice that it may feel like the daily pain points of modern living. And so it can be hard to identify, at least in this modern world with so many demands that we have, when our metabolic health begins to become less efficient, less functional. And so what would you recommend in terms of getting a good sense of how our metabolic health is actually functioning in the body?
Yeah. And you make a really good point where some things are observable, like the way you feel can be indicating, but then there's also a lot of things where, first of all, what is normal for a lot of people. So if you felt a certain way for so long, it can be hard to understand that that's not the best way to feel. It's kind of like, the frog analogy of like you slowly turn up the water and boil the frog versus putting it in boiling water. When you make slow changes over time, you can't tell as much the drastic change. So when people are used to being poor energy, poor sleep, over stress, they don't realize the type of impact that that's having on their health. So we do want to look at both subjective and objective information to kind of assess how you're doing. Unfortunately, there isn't just like a one test, one number we can look at to tell you your metabolic health. Maybe one day, I have a feeling that will come eventually, but we do want to pay attention to how we feel. What are your energy levels? Are you getting kind of that brain fog, difficulty concentrating, kind of moodiness, hanger, so to speak, if a meal is coming up? So those subjective feelings are important. And then objectively, kind of metabolic health, we want to look at your waist circumference, so how much abdominal fat you have, those triglycerides and HDL, as you mentioned. And then we also really want to hone into glucose specifically, in addition to blood pressure. But Glucose is something that I've obviously become very passionate about because of how impactful I think monitoring that one metric can be. Since we don't have one metric overall to tell you your metabolic health, that's the one, if you're going to pick one thing to focus on, that I think gives you the best picture overall of how you're doing. Because our glucose fluctuates in response to what we're eating, how we're moving, like we mentioned, our sleep levels, our stress levels, and then the environment around us. So it's going to give you a good idea of how your body is responding in this energy processing system. So the best way to look at your glucose is that continuous glucose monitor, because you can see 24/7 what your glucose is doing. You can learn a lot in a short amount of time. So it can be really powerful for giving you good visibility into what your metabolic health looks like. But that is, a more expensive device for some people. So any way that you can kind of capture how your glucose is looking, whether that's for the traditional metrics of a fasting glucose level or hemoglobin A1C, which gives you your average glucose, that's definitely better than nothing. That's going to give you some indication. We can dig into the pros and cons if you'd like, but the more data from the CGM is going to give you a more robust view of what's happening behind the hood, so to speak.
I agree with you. And I'm curious, when we think about wearing one and we're kind of looking at the impact of stress or the impact of sleep, or obviously what we're putting in our mouths and then our movement, in the data and even in your own personal experience, how can someone kind of sift through that for themselves on the day to day? Because it's a lot of different like metrics to be paying attention to at the same time. You're like, was it the chips or was it my lack of sleep?
Absolutely. So first, it's like can be a lot of information, and someone like yourself or me who've worn many, eventually you start to see your patterns, and then you can easily put one on once a quarter and quickly identify, oh, my glucose was higher this morning because I didn't sleep well last night. So you do understand your trends over time. But there's 3 general information metrics you want to look at when you're wearing the CGM for the glucose. One is your fasted glucose level. So what's happening when you haven't eaten for, at least 8 hours. We want to see that pretty steady between like 70 and 90 range. A little bit of like, movement up and down during that is normal. It's your body just constantly maintaining homeostasis. But we do want to see, relatively flat in that range when you're fasted. The second is what happens when you eat. So anytime you kind of have a meal of any type, we want to see how high does your glucose go, and then how quickly does it come back down to those baseline levels that you were at before you ate. So we don't want to see it go above 140 if you're a non-diabetic. If you're on a low carb diet, then we would rarely see it go above 120 ideally. And then we want to see it come back down to normal about 2 to 3 hours after eating. And then that third one is just your average glucose. So you can look at it through a 24-hour window, 3-day window, 14-day window, however long you have data. We want to see your average glucose below 105. And that kind of gives you that holistic view of how much glucose you have running through your system, because we don't want that average value to be too high either.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I think that's one of the numbers that a lot of people don't pay attention to is that average glucose. As we want to be looking at I think when you went on for the first time, you're scanning a lot. But it's that average glucose and that kind of variability as well that I think is so critical. That gives you a really like a bigger insight as to what is going on. When we're wearing one and we're looking at that as well, how, I always think about also be monitoring how you feel, like symptoms, or I wouldn't call them symptoms so much, but however your body is feeling at the same time too, to kind of measure it against what's going on with the continuous glucose monitor.
100%. And that's one of the amazing parts about real-time continuous data like this as well, is it actually really enhances people's mind-body connection. So when you're seeing the numbers, like you said, we don't always know what it feels like to have our glucose at 120, or what it feels like to jump 40 points, or what it feels like to get a little low. So when you're seeing that and you're really thinking about how you feel, eventually when you're not wearing it, you kind of start to learn, like, I feel like my glucose is a little high right now, or I feel like I'm kind of swinging up and down right now. And that will help you pinpoint kind of when you're not wearing it, what you might need to do, enhance that mind-body connection, which helps usually make us have better decisions. And then it also can find where you might be at at your sweet spot. So from the research we know in the literature, most people, we don't want to see them go above that 140, but we have noticed that people feel different at different levels. So some people are like, maybe 140, but when I go above 120, I don't feel good. Like I start to get that brain fog. I start to get kind of hangry, or I start to get, various symptoms. So knowing that about yourself is the most important thing in the end.
Yeah. And I think it's sometimes too, when we're wearing one, if, and my recommendation is always at least to try this once. You may also notice, I think this is also, interesting, is that it may hike up to, 140, 130 from like 90 milligrams per deciliter. And you may not even notice. And I think that's also an aha moment of, when we start to see those higher numbers, that, this is kind of, those subtle kind of behind the scenes changes in our metabolic health as a response to what we're eating, can kind of add up over time. And we may not really realize that this is happening, especially at least for my ladies, my community, who land between ages of 40 and 60. So women in midlife, where, they're doing an annual check, maybe they're running labs every year, every 2 years, and really don't have a sense of things, and are just, running around trying to handle all the things that they're doing. And so again, a lot of these subtle symptoms of metabolic inefficiency or metabolic dysfunction really do feel like everyday life. And so looking at those numbers, I think, can be a real aha moment. When it comes to our metabolic health, particularly in midlife, this is the area that I love to focus on the most, because this is the women that I'm taking care of. And this is where I really start to see it massively shift. In the data that you're looking at, one, are you seeing those types of shifts too happening in the data? And two, have you seen some, basically indicators towards anything else that we should be mindful of? Like, why is it that it can be so important in this time to really pay attention to these numbers?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you mentioned kind of at the beginning as well, is you can't always feel those shifts. And often what we see is those higher after meal values. So what's happening when you're eating meals tend to be the first earliest indicator of glucose dysregulation. So we tend to see deviations at mealtime before we start to see your average glucose come up, before we start to see that fasted glucose come up. So sometimes, if you're only looking at the traditional metrics, it might take multiple decades for those numbers to flag as abnormal in a traditional, lab report. So you might get that your A1C is pre-diabetic, but your mealtime glucose values have probably been abnormal for at least 10 years. So the sooner that we can catch those things, if we can see those abnormalities earlier, then the easier it is to change them. It's now just a tweak of your meals, and you have better values, and you never get to that pre-diabetic level. And it's much, much easier to fix that. So the sooner we can catch these abnormalities, the easier it is to fix. But the good news is that no matter where you are in the spectrum of metabolic health, whether that's pre-diabetes, type 2 diabetes, you can always make improvements. We've always seen people be able to shift it into better metabolic health. So there's things you can do. It's 100% in your control to be able to make improvements. But as you mentioned, especially the audience of women in midlife, when we started this company 6 years ago and we started seeing people's non-diabetic CGM data specifically, there was zero research or information about what normal glucose trends were. And it became very clear after working with the first couple thousand customers that this subcategory of people do have different glucose responses. And so then digging into the research, seeing more and more, we do know that menopause is an independent risk factor for higher fasted glucose levels and insulin resistance and metabolic dysfunction in general. So there's a very real hormonal changes that are happening during this time, whether we like it or not, right? It's very real. And this is actually a similar trend we see just in monthly menstruation cycles, where when we see kind of estrogen decrease, we see our ability to dispose of glucose as properly decrease a little bit. So we have higher forms of insulin resistance at those phases, particularly the luteal phase, when our hormones are at a certain point. So then we see this kind of in a more extreme version and a prolonged version during menopause, where we see women have less insulin sensitivity and glucose tolerance than they did before. So maybe 20 years before, they might have been able to have a breakfast of, sourdough toast, eggs, avocado, and everything looked looks fine. And now they're having it and their glucose is 20, 30 points higher than it used to be. So that's a very typical response we might see. And we have been able to make these responses more successful. And we've seen enough data to know that there are a few things you can do to kind of set yourself up for success. One is acknowledging that you might have to make dietary changes as your physiology changes, and not viewing this as like a negative thing necessarily. So kind of celebrating the changes that are happening and empowering yourself with the information that now we might need a different approach. Just like if you're training for a marathon, you're going to have a different dietary approach than if you are just kind of walking every day and doing daily movement. We adjust our fuel based off of our current physiology. So we tend to see the best response with a lower carbohydrate intake. So really reducing some of those carbohydrates and increasing protein and fats instead, and really emphasizing more protein than most women are consuming. Because not only is that going to help with the glucose control, but we also know that during these physiological changes, we're also breaking down muscle mass more quickly than we are at other stages of life. So we need more protein to maintain our muscle mass, which helps us with metabolic health and insulin sensitivity. And then that will also help us with some of that glucose control. So protein and strength training and reducing carbohydrates, those three things are what we kind of emphasize with women. And it seems to help a lot. But you do have to make some changes because the physiology is a very real thing, very real changes that happen during this time.
It is a very real thing. And I really do appreciate you bringing up the fact that we kind of see a version of this every monthly cycle in that luteal phase where progesterone is increased, but estradiol is on the lower side. And yeah, we notice that level of insulin resistance, the cravings, and the kind of the symptoms that go along with it. And so it's interesting to me, like this, we were running this cycle for, decades. And then we get to a point where everything really starts to decline and fluctuate. And that's where we start to see these greater changes. Are there any others? So I love the interventions of more protein, resistance training, and just having the mindset of we get to pivot into the second half of our life. We get to train a little bit differently into the second half of our life. Are there other interventions that you have found to be really profound, not only for women in midlife, but also people overall when it comes to dialing in their cellular energy and their metabolic health?
Yeah. Another big thing to consider is the timing of your meals. As you kind of mentioned a few times, if it's too late or night, or if it's in the evening, like that's going to make an impact. So for most people, our metabolic health, our insulin sensitivity, it works on a circadian rhythm, just like all of our other hormones. So we are most insulin sensitive, most primed to metabolize our food and efficiently utilize that energy during daytime hours. So particularly like middle of the day, think about whenever the sun is out, that's probably when we're most primed to metabolize efficiently. So if we're eating late at night, especially the higher carbohydrate meals late at night, we're going to have these larger and more prolonged glucose responses at that time. So we've seen this over and over. I've done these experiments on myself. It's something, if you are wearing a CGM, to test out, to have the same exact meal during the day and at night and see how your response differs. But people generally tend to have those larger responses at night. So kind of shifting your dinner time up a little bit as much as possible. I know that sometimes